Hello and welcome to the Undercurrent Stories podcast. I'm your host, Bob Wells. Today we're exploring the AI revolution through the eyes of someone uniquely qualified to guide you through it. He isn't just another tech commentator, he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter and author who covered Silicon Valley for the New York Times during its most transformative moments, such as the dot-com boom. And he's written 11 books on technology and society. My guest today is Gary Rivlin. His latest book, AI Valley, takes you inside the trillion-dollar race reshaping our world. What makes Gary special is his rare combination of technical understanding and access to the key players during this 70-year story from the 1950s dreamers to today's AI gold rush. To say I never thought it went back that far. So whether you're a working professional, student, retiree or stay-at-home parent, this conversation is something vital for you. In the interview, you'll discover why the AI breakthrough finally happened now and where it's truly heading. How to use AI as your competitive advantage rather than fear it as a threat. Which AI warnings from industry insiders you should actually worry about. And practical strategies to protect and advance your career or enhance your daily life in an AI-driven world. By the end of this episode, you'll have insider knowledge that most people don't possess. Knowledge that will help you thrive rather than be displaced by this transformation, regardless of your current situation. So here's what I suggest you do. Listen with a pen and paper ready as Gary shares specific, actionable advice that could transform your approach to work and career, whatever you do. I hope you enjoy today's show. Hello and welcome to Undercurrent Stories, Gary.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
It's great to have you on. Thank you ever so much for coming on. You got the new book out, which I have 90% finished. I've been listening to it on Spotify as part of my membership. And what I really like about the book is it's a story. It's techie, but not too techie. And it's a story. And I didn't realize how far back the actual sort of history of AI went.
Yeah, I didn't either until I jumped into this. It's incredible. The term artificial intelligence was actually coined in the 1950s. And what I found so interesting is how overly optimistic the computer scientists, mathematicians, those who were working on artificial intelligence in the 50s and 60s were like AI or usable AI that would be integrated into our life, to their view, was always just 10 years away. So for 70 years, it was just around the next corner. It really wasn't until the 2020s, let's say the end of 2022, that their vision, what they imagined that, a wide number of people would be using AI, it took about 70 years.
Yeah. Okay, well, before we talk about AI and your book, could you just please tell us a bit about yourself, Gary? I'm sure our listeners would be very interested to hear your background, where you grew up, and what eventually got you into becoming a journalist, focusing on sort of techie stuff.
Right. So I grew up in New York. I'm based in New York City now. And, I actually went to school as an engineer. So I took programming and, calculus and all that. But I just got interested in the wider world. It just seemed so much more interesting than whatever I was working on in the chem lab or the computer center. And so, I joked that I would take a year off before applying to law school. And now I guess I'm on like my 40th year off. I just fell in love with journalism. It's interesting. I kind of started more of an activist in the sense that, I was living in Chicago. I went to school in Chicago, college in Chicago, and the politics were really interesting. And I just thought the coverage by the mainstream media was really poor. So I kind of jumped on it to kind of make an argument, essentially. But, over time, I really got into the craft of journalism. And now I describe myself more as a storyteller, as you suggested in the introduction. I tend to tell my stories through characters,
Yes.
Rather than just sort of laying out the dry facts. I try to introduce you to people and we join their journey. And through that journey, hopefully you learn about artificial intelligence in the case of my most current book, or, New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, whatever the topic is.
Yeah, I think I found that in the book. I found that the sort of talking about characters adds colour. I like the way you sort of showed the backgrounds of some of these guys and how ambitious they were, particularly some of the chaps who'd been brought up in sort of fairly poor or average circumstances, but they wanted to go far, and they did go far, and the hunger that they've got. So I think that's what enhances the story.
Well, thank you. And, it really is interesting, this kind of great man theory of technology, that it's the drive of certain individuals with AI, Sam Altman out of London, Mustafa Suleiman and Dennis Hassabis, who were the co-founders with a third gentleman of DeepMind, which was the first great machine learning startup. It was sold to Google for $650 million in 2014. But, Zuckerberg, Musk, so much of it is the drive of these individuals to succeed, to make their products used by millions, hundreds of millions, billions, to make piles of money, whatever their motivation might be. If they had mommy issues, it didn't make a difference. This drove them to greatness, and we're using the products that they created during that drive.
It's interesting talking about the drive. I mean, it's been like this throughout history, and I've only got to look. Yesterday, I was watching television, and you've probably got it in the US, The Gilded Age, which tells the story of the guy who is building railroads right across America. Again, that same sort of hunger and ambition. So nothing changes really in that respect, does it?
Just add zeros and ones.
One question I'd like to ask before we talk a bit more about AI is, what made you want to write the book?
So I covered tech in the mid-1990s, which was a fascinating period, the dot-com era, the rise of the internet. I was writing, first for Wire, then I became a correspondent for the New York Times covering Silicon Valley. So for like this 10-year period, a very interesting period, basically the rise of Netscape, the internet, going global, through, Google going public, and, kind of the rise of Facebook. And, I've always kind of toggled between tech and politics, urban issues, my whole career. I've written 11 books, and they're kind of 50-50, basically tech versus, non-tech. And so I hadn't really written much about tech for the previous decade or so, but randomly I got this email from Reid Hoffman. Reid Hoffman is a co-founder of LinkedIn, very well-known character in Silicon Valley, first money in Facebook, early investor in Airbnb, really huge name. And I got this batch email, this dear friend, I checked, I'm one of over 2,000 friends who got the email. A different day I might have hit delete. But in it, he just announced that he was co-founding his first startup since LinkedIn around artificial intelligence. And I had programmed, and it's just always frustrating. You make a little syntax error and nothing would work. And there was one line in there that just really captured my imagination. Instead of us learning the machine's language, symbolic code and stuff, the machine is going to learn our language, that English is going to be the next programming language. And it's just like I read that email and this line in my head, speaking human. That's a book. And so it was just amazing timing, because it was, December of 2022, literally only a few days after ChatGPT had been released. And ChatGPT, I hadn't even heard of it at that point. There was kind of a delay. Everyone knows that ChatGPT was released at the end of 2022, and it just took over the world. But it took a few weeks before the news spread. So, I'm thinking, this is a really interesting artificial intelligence. I haven't really thought about that since I'm in my 20s, kind of thing. And then, as I'm contemplating, and suddenly the whole world is talking about AI and ChatGPT. So I just started 2023. I just jumped back on. My approach was, let's look at the various folks trying to cash in on AI, whether it was founders, investors, the big tech companies like a Google and Microsoft.
Yeah, it is a gold rush time, isn't it? And still is.
It is. It was very familiar to me, given my coverage of the .com era. But it's interesting. I would say AI is both overhyped and underhyped. The overhyped, I don't really have to work very hard to demonstrate that. Someone promising, a well-known figure would say, "I have an idea for a AI startup," and investors are just throwing hundreds of millions, in a couple of cases, billions of dollars of them with barely just a memo. So, it was that kind of hype that just billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars were being thrown at AI startups. And so that's the hype. And, of course, most of them will not work. That's the venture capital game. That's Silicon Valley. But the underhype point is, I think that the impact of AI, if you look ahead 10 years, will be profound, just as profound as the internet, in that it's touched everything, education, corporations, social interactions, just like the smartphone. It took a while, but changed everything. And I think AI is going to be that kind of transformative platform that changes businesses, changes education, changes, organizations of all kind, and changes our interaction. In fact, my kid, I have a high schooler, just showed me this meme that making fun of like the next generation is going to be disapproving of their child's relationship with a robot, and how we're, instead of racist, we're robotist kind of thing. And I actually think that, as hard as it is for many of us to imagine, I think we're going to see people, I don't know, 2 years, 5 years, I can't say, it's starting to happen, have these profound relationships with AI that outsiders can't understand, but it's going to become a thing.
Yeah, you look back at the .com boom. You look at internet shopping, which I guess is the same in America. It's destroyed a lot of the traditional towns in terms of what they're selling. I mean, they've diversified in their coffee shops or their restaurants and stuff, and now we've got more and more out of town places. But it's totally changed the character of English towns.
Well, actually, my previous book, Saving Main Street, was about small businesses trying to survive COVID. And one of the big themes is COVID hit, 2020, COVID hit, after they were already reeling from what you're talking about, that, kind of commercial strips, especially in smaller towns, were, half of them were empty storefronts because there were, retailers that went out of business because of, online shopping. And, AI is going to have profound impacts, some of which we can imagine, some of which we can't imagine. But, I actually think instead of it wiping out, small businesses across the countryside, it's going to wipe out large swaths of jobs. It will create jobs just like the internet created jobs. And I will say, on the other side of this argument, when I was covering the internet in the second half of the 90s, it's going to destroy jobs, it's going to destroy jobs. Well, unemployment in the U.S. at least is at 4%. I'm not sure it destroyed jobs. It created a lot of jobs. Well, it did destroy jobs, but it created a lot of new jobs. And I don't doubt AI is going to create new jobs in ways we can't imagine right now. But I actually think it's going to be a big net negative, that it's going to destroy a lot more jobs than it creates.
Well, I'd like to get into that a bit later on. But the first thing I'd like to do, and it's really a techie one, in terms of the LLMs, that's the large language models.
Correct.
Which have to take in data. Could you just explain to listeners how something like OpenAI, ChatGPT, obtains its, well, there's a few questions in this. How does it obtain all that information to be able to spill answers to people? And how is it continually updating what it's got? Is it partially using Google searches and other, or is somebody actually inputting the data into it on a day-by-day basis?
Right. So kind of the bigger picture here is, and this goes back to the first question about the history, like, there are kind of two basic approaches. One you could call rule-based. We're going to teach AI line by line by line, trying to imagine every circumstance, whether, driving, answering questions, whatever. And that, for 50 years, computer scientists tried it. It didn't quite work. What took over was machine learning, which is what you're describing, that, the machine learns in the fashion of a human. Rather than teaching it line by line by line, they say, hey, go read this, go read these books, these articles, or for images, look at a gazillion images and learn that way. So the large language models are trained on a large corpus of data, books, articles, chats, Amazon reviews, whatever they could get their hands on, you ask, what did they train on? Well, some of it, they broke the rules of intellectual property. They, trained it on, books like authors like me without permission. And that's in the courts right now. OpenAI, the other big makers of these LLMs, are now, after the fact, going and seeking permission from magazines, from media outlets, from Associated Press, Reuters, news services.
So sorry to interrupt, Gary. So for example, your book, what you're saying is OpenAI would buy a copy of your book, scan it into the system, and then the model, the large language model, would actually absorb all that text. Is that what would happen?
Right. There's kind of a third party that would kind of assemble and batch stuff and sell it. I'm not sure they, in quotes, paid for my book, but, I do know that my books were used for at least one of the large language models. It was leaked out, and you could check. And I was very pleased and upset at the same time that all 11 of my books had been read. But wait, I don't remember being compensated for any of that. But to get to the main question you're asking is so training one of these models, it takes months. It just read every book and article, every chat you could get your hands on. That takes a long time, months. It's very expensive too. Then comes fine tuning. Okay, it's trained, but it doesn't know how to answer questions, and you want it to have a certain ability to synthesize. You want it to be able to chat in a very human-like fashion and stuff. That's the fine tuning stage. And so, but they're static. Once they're trained and released. So when OpenAI, when they released ChatGPT, it was stuck in time. So if you asked it, what was the scores of last night's football games, it couldn't answer it because it was stuck a year or two behind.
Yeah.
One of the breakthroughs that's happened, which you suggest in your question, is that they've now connected to search engines. Okay. And so it took time to do that. I mean, this is all kind of a process where we're using it, but we're the kind of the test dummies on these things, and it's improving. But I guess what you could do is take a model and say, okay, read yesterday's newspaper and update it. But instead what they do is, but that's really lengthy, and you make a change here, it might make other changes. You want to test these things before you release it. So what most companies are doing, that are putting out these foundational models, large language models that will help create video, audio, whatever. They put it out and then they connect it to a web browser so it has more current information.
So does that mean that the big tech companies, Meta, Google, Microsoft, and the startups like OpenAI, they're all doing this themselves? So they're all basically replicating the same job in terms of obtaining all that data?
Yeah, exactly. And, it's kind of part of the problem for all these companies because, we'll charge $20 a month to a consumer user. We'll charge a lot more of that to a business user. Well, you can use an almost as good one for free, because they're all leapfrogging one another. So you could use OpenAI's latest, greatest version and pay $20 a month, or you could use the one that they had put out 6 months ago, which is pretty terrific too, and suits your purpose for free. And so the problem right now, I'll use OpenAI, I know their numbers. So, last year they booked around $3.5 billion in revenue, which is incredible because 2 years earlier they had virtually zero in revenues. Some of that is from the $20 a month from users, but largely is from businesses who want to use their product on their site. However, $3.5 billion, that's a big number. They still lost $5 billion because it costs so much money to train these things, so much money to fine tune them, and significantly so much money to operate them. There are different estimates out there, but to use the cutting edge, the most powerful models out there nowadays, it's costing these companies $1 to $4 per query. So millions of people are putting these queries. So it's costing them millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions. In fact, it's funny. One of the startups I found it, I didn't find it. One of the startups I started following shortly after I began, they actually had to stop marketing themselves and withhold features because it was costing them so much money every month that they wanted fewer users because otherwise they would go bankrupt too soon. So, one of the issues, and we could get into it, is like this stuff is so expensive. It costs so much money to operate that it really favors the giants. Google has $100 billion or so in cash just sticking around. A startup that needs $1 billion to train one of these things, well, they have to raise that money from a venture capitalist. So, very, very expensive to create these things. And the technicians, the engineers, not technicians, the engineers who are, kind of creating these things, they're pulling down salaries in the millions now. So it's just very, very expensive, which is, if you're going to do the foundational models, the large language models, it's at this point largely out of reach of any startup.
I was amazed how the amount of energy used, if I put a query into ChatGPT, the amount of energy used electrically to actually give me my answers is something like 10 times what a Google search would be.
Yeah, roughly. That was kind of an estimate someone put out there, and people said you overstated that. It's impossible to tell, but directionally, it takes a lot more resources to answer for AI to answer a question than a Google search. I mean, we could talk about the pros and cons of AI, but one of the cons is it's really kind of putting us on a collision course with climate change. They're predicting that by 2030 we're going to have to double the number of data centers out there, and they're really energy hogs. And so that's a big issue here. How much energy these things consume.
Hi, it's Bob here. Just a quick interlude. Hope you're enjoying this episode. And if you would like to hear more interesting interviews, we have over 150 episodes to date with many fascinating guests talking about a wide variety of topics, which include music, history, philosophy, fitness, food and drink, adventure, contemporary culture, and many, many more. I'm sure there's something that you'd really enjoy. So all you need to do is just visit undercurrentstories.com or search Undercurrent Stories in any of the podcast platforms. And now back to the show. One of the things that I think you infer in the book is that, particularly with the big tech, the models, they've got political leanings in terms of the answers they give. And you mentioned earlier on about the sort of tweaking, fine-tuning. I guess that comes from that, does it?
Exactly. So, early on, so in 2015, there was this famous moment among people in AI. Microsoft put out an early large language model chatbot called Tay. And it was trained on social media, which in retrospect was a mistake. And within 24 hours of putting this thing out, it was a Nazi saluting, racist, it was spitting out vile like you sometimes see on the internet. If you want to know why these models sound like humans, it's because they were trained on our material, on our writing. And so Microsoft immediately pulled that. And so there was a big push, like, we can't have these things sounding racist or misogynist or saying anti-Semitic things. So through fine tuning, you teach it like, no, you really can't say that, even though you probably read it in some Reddit post. So there was a reaction on the conservative side, the right-wing side of things, like about woke AI, politically correct AI, and really interesting experiments. Mark Andreessen, large figure in Silicon Valley, co-founder of Netscape, a significant venture capitalist these days. He said there was the Obergefell's decision, the U.S. Supreme Court, allowing for gay marriage. And he said, write me a brief in favor of gay marriage. Did a perfect job of it. Write me a brief against gay marriage. It refused to do it because being against gay marriage is wrong. And so now there's kind of the counter side. So Elon Musk has Grok, that's from his XAI, his AI company, and he's trying to do anti-woke AI. And again, it's the same kind of thing, but there's been stuff on his side where, you would ask it a random question and suddenly it's talking about, the South African government treating whites in a horrible way. It's like, what? I didn't even bring that up. And so, we haven't quite got the balance yet. But I'm convinced that we're going to have in the future just like we have more conservative leaning newspapers and more liberal leaning newspapers, we're going to have more conservative leaning AI and more liberal leaning AI. So in other words, the same siloed world, us versus them, I think AI is going to perpetuate.
I'm very interested in how the advent of AI and the use of it affects our brains. And a report that came in from the MIT, which you've probably seen, have you, Gary?
Yes, yeah, it just came out
where it shows cognitive decline in students who are regularly using ChatGPT, and it's got a photo of a brain scan for essays, and I guess that is. I mean, I use AI. I use ChatGPT for this podcast, and I've been using it, shall we say, marginally, but I'm in danger of doing it too much sometimes, because what I'll do is I will, after this interview, I will get it transcribed. It'll go into, let's say, ChatGPT, and I'll say, suggest 10 titles for this episode. And some of them are quite good. I normally end up making
I use it too for that kind of thing. I'm amazed by it.
Yeah. So I like to think of it as a almost like it's like having two people in the team, whereas there's just me, there's somebody else, and that's my assistant. That's how I think of it. That's how I justify the use of it. But I am also quite concerned that actually, I'd heard about that report before, by the way. I'd heard other stuff where people are sort of saying that they're not using their brain as much. And I found myself, I'm not using my brain as much. I used to spend a lot of time thinking about the show notes and stuff like that. I'm not using as much now. I'm tending to use ChatGPT for that as well. And that worries me because I'm not stimulating certain areas of my brain. What do you think of that? Is that an issue going forward, do you think?
So at first I'd say you're using AI properly. It's a co-pilot. It's you're using it today. Let's bounce ideas. It gives you ideas, and just like using it, you are determining which is a good title. You're probably tweaking the title, maybe merging two of the ideas. Whatever. So what you're talking about is cognitive offloading. And when the calculator came out, they said, "Oh my God, kids aren't going to understand math anymore because they're going to have a calculator." Like, that didn't come true. GPS. I joke like, my brother moved a few years ago to the far off suburbs. I have no idea how to get there. If suddenly my phone died, I would not know even the remotest directions to get there. So cognitive offloading, we're doing that with GPS and stuff. And I'm sure that's happening. I'm sure it's going to continue happening and get worse. But let me push back. Okay, you're not using your brain for this or that, but you're using it for other things. I mean,
yes.
AI could be a good assistant. I'd rather spend my time focused on task A. Can you help me with task B and C, which are important to what I do? But I'd rather focus my brain on this. With that said, what worries me is cheating. You're a high school English student, and you have to write an essay on Lord of the Flies. And you go to ChatGPT and it cranks out your essay and you hand it in. And okay, you've learned nothing. I do think education is going to have to change a lot more in-class kind of assignments.
I agree.
Because it's essential that you know how to compose a thought. You don't have to be a writer, but, in jobs, you have to write reports. You have to think through things. You have to write memos. You have to write emails, whatever it might be. You need that skill. So I am scared of what you're talking about, but I'll just say on the other side, that's one study, and I also that there's been a lot of pushback to, and I think it's more nuanced than that. I'd like to offload a lot of stuff I don't want to do, so I could pay attention to writing, and so I use it as an editor. I use it as a research assistant. I check footnotes because of hallucinations. It makes mistakes. So if I see a quote, I have to go, oh, that was a quote from CNBC. But it's really a helpful assistant that lets me be more efficient with my time. It's almost like this superpower. I could, it takes me days to write something, but I could have it edited and give me suggestions. Oh, you made a typo here. You left out a word. Maybe you should use this as a better transition kind of thing. And I like that I have this at the ready 24 hours a day editor that takes seconds. The old days, as of 2 years ago, you hand an editor an article and hope within the next week you hear back. Here I'm getting instant feedback. Like, there's something wrong with this. Can you tell me what's wrong with it? It tells me what's wrong with it, and then I can go fix it.
And I guess, 25 years ago, if you were writing a book, you'd be going to the library, wouldn't you? And you'd be spending time traveling to the library, looking through a load of books, reference books. Now you can just jump on the internet and get it. So it's a sort of step process, isn't it?
No, exactly. So it's more like 30 years ago. So, I'd go to the library. So it's interesting. I've been doing this since the 1980s. And it used to be if I'd have to go to the library and look through, what was it, microfiche?
Oh, yes.
Kind of like, almost film strips of newspapers and stuff, and look for the article, look for the information. Or, here in the U.S., we have the government publication rooms. And, the government would put out books, and there'd be depots around the country where you could go read whatever reports and, hearing transcripts, whatever. With the internet, you don't have to leave your room and you can read that. Now with AI, in fact, kind of the bigger point is I think AI is the semiconductor / computer, personal computer, plus the internet, plus the cloud, plus mobile. And now we have AI that is all building on each other. And, there are repercussions to that. There's a fallout, and we're talking about one piece of it.
What do you think about the Geoffrey Hinton warnings? Obviously, he's sort of known, isn't he, as the sort of godfather of AI, and yet he stepped away from it, and he seems to be spending a lot of time talking about the warnings. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so he's kind of the godfather of machine learning. While almost every academic working with artificial intelligence was doing this rules-based approach, Geoffrey Hinton, a Brit, was saying, no, it's machine learning. That the only way we're going to have useful AI is through machine learning. And he was a prophet in the wilderness in the 90s, and eventually his approach took precedent. That was back in the 2010s, mid 2010s. It shifted to machine learning. So he's a giant in the field, and he had created a startup that Google bought. So he went to work for Google, and so he quit, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years ago, because he felt working for Google, he couldn't speak his mind the way he wanted to. It's interesting. There's a lot of people a lot smarter than us about computers and machine learning who are all over the place. On the one hand, he's warning like, oh, it's going to take over, all this bad stuff's going to happen. But another one of the, in quotes, godfathers of AI points out that these things are really limited. It's like, it's as dumb as a cat. I mean, there's an expression, the stochastic parrot. Stochastic, essentially means random. A parrot, it's finding patterns and it's repeating it, but it no more understands the words it's saying than a parrot does. So it's so limited. They talk about reasoning models. These things can't reason. They can emulate human reasoning. So they're still really, really limited. So another one of the giants of AI, an early pioneer of machine learning, Jan LeCun, he says it's like these kind of warnings are like, the Wright brothers created their airplane. We're worrying about jet propulsion engines. We're not really there yet. There needs to be a couple of breakthroughs before these things are, to my mind, until these things are as powerful as people fear. I mean, we could get into the negatives, but as far as the kind of the existential warnings about kind of laser-eyed robots are going to take over kind of warnings, I just don't even think we're close to that.
But who could be one day?
Laser-eyed robots, like, I don't think in our life, let me answer that differently. I wish we were worrying about the stuff that's within line of sight. The real fears today. We touched on one, global warming, that this is such an energy hog that it's going to, it's going to get us to a crisis point more quickly. Another big concern of mine is AI right now is really in the hands of big tech. And, we've seen what big tech did with social media. There's mistrust towards big tech, I think, for good reasons. And so that's another worry of mine, that something as powerful as artificial intelligence, something as transformative as artificial intelligence, is in the hands of so few people.
Yeah.
Using AI for surveillance. That's scary. Google vowed never, never, never would we use RA. When they bought DeepMind, they vowed never would we use AI for surveillance. They changed that policy at the start of this year. Google said we would never use AI in warfare, or we would never let our AI be used in warfare. They changed their policy at the beginning of this year. So that's another set of concerns: use of AI for surveillance and warfare. Autonomous AI. As we've been talking about, AI is an amazing tool. It's a great co-pilot. It helps you. But the idea of autonomous AI, it doesn't have reason. It has no common sense. So it would make all these rational decisions, but something could come up that no human would ever make that decision that it can make. There always has to be a human in the loop. Right now, with where AI is, I say it always. Me personally, I wish there was always a human in the loop, no matter how good this stuff becomes. Recursive AI is another concern. This is this idea that these machine models, these large language models, aren't static like we were talking about before, but they self-improve. See, that's dangerous. Even the people who create these things, they call it the black box problem. They don't quite understand what why they say what they say. You could say, well, that's true of humans too. Like, they've read all these books. We've taught them the right, kind of ethics and all that stuff. And they say crazy things. But, the people who are creating these models don't understand exactly why they're doing what they're doing. So the idea of recursive, self-improving AI, is really frightening. One more beat on that they keep on experimenting with these models. There's a recent one from Anthropic. They are the creators of Claude, one of the real popular large language model chatbots out there. And they gave it, false information about made up engineers. And they said, they're going to pull the plug on you for the next version. But by the way, this engineer is having an affair at work. And so the AI would use that information to try to stop the engineer from pulling the plug. And so, again, it's learning from humans, and there's a lot of brilliant information that it's learning. But there's a lot of nefarious, plotting, dissembling that it's also learning. So, kind of self-improving AI without a human in the loop frightens me a lot.
What role do you think government and regulation should play in all this?
So, it's interesting that started 2023 when I started this project. Trust and safety inside every company was a really, really big deal. And that's sort of gone out the window as this has grown more competitive, as the race to win has become more prominent. Trust and safety has been shoved aside. Here in the States, there was under President Biden kind of a modest effort to require these large language models. If you're going to do cutting edge, powerful stuff, you have to share the data with the government, what you're doing. There were requirements about testing it before you released it. Donald Trump took over within 24 hours of being president. He undid that. There was an executive order. He just undid that executive order. Globally, there's been 3 significant conferences in the last couple of years on AI. The first actually was in London. Was it Bletchley? Am I saying that right?
Bletchley near Milton Keynes. Yeah.
Right. And the big theme of the first 2 was safety. And I was sympathetic to their point of view. This has such great potential. We're so optimistic about its potential to change, science, medicine, improve education, but we have these fears about AI unchecked. A powerful tool for good is a powerful tool for bad. And so what could we do to make sure it's more of a net positive than a net negative? All technologies cut both ways. And so the first conference, the second conference, international conference, trust and safety was the main focus. They had the third one in Paris in January. Trust and safety was barely brought up. It was all about, how do we beat the Chinese? Stop with and the vice president of the U.S., gave a speech, stop with the hand wringing, let's just innovate. And so that is my fear that I wouldn't want to stop innovation, but I'd like there to be certain guardrails, and let's debate these issues about. I'll give you another one. So using AI in passing judgment essentially about people for sentencing in a criminal case, using it to root out criminals and stuff. It's a tool, but it's got a lot of biases in it. Should we rent to these people as a landlord? Using AI for that is really, really dangerous because there's a lot of implicit bias that's been baked into the training material. And so, again, what should we use this for? What should we not use this for? And when these companies, private companies, are putting out these powerful models, let's have some kind of sense of what they're doing, and let's have some sort of requirements that they test these things before they release it on the general public.
Where I used to work, we had a marketing department with probably about 30 people in it. They had various roles, and one of the roles would have been to research. If they were going to do a promotion on a particular product, some people would spend a lot of time researching the market, getting the numbers, getting the data. Other people will then put together some form of promotion and advertisement. And I can see AI can help there. And that's where jobs will change.
Right. So there's this kind of simple construct, AI replacing humans. I think for the short and medium term in many job categories, and you're raising one, that people who use AI will replace people who don't use AI, or a different way of looking at it is shrinkage. So you said there were 30 people working in that marketing department. I can imagine in 2 or 4 or 5 years that there's 10 or 12 people working in that marketing department, because AI could do a perfectly reasonable job of writing basic reports, kind of like gaming out, like a human using AI could do a lot more than a human not doing AI. And so I fear what's going to happen in all sorts of categories, job categories, marketing, legal, etc., finance, that a team is going to be some humans, but some AI agents that are maximized for, searching out marketing data, or, kind of reading through legal briefs, whatever it might be. And so kind of over time, I think that the 30-person department is going to be the 20-person department is going to be the 10-person department.
What would you say to somebody who's in their mid-career, perhaps in their early 40s? They don't really know an awful lot about AI. They use chatbots when they go online. They may be a little bit apprehensive about it. What would you say to them?
Use it, get comfortable with it, because it's a really important skill. Just like, in the second half of the 1990s, if you can use spreadsheets, if you knew how to use the internet, you had these marketable skills. Again, I think humans who use AI are going to best people who don't use AI. And so I really do think it's important to figure out how you can use AI in your job, or how your organization could use AI, and become very, very comfortable with that. Because again, I think looking ahead, not that far. I mean, I'm talking about a year or 2 years, maybe 5 years ahead, there's going to be shrinkage. And if you're the one who knows how to amplify your intelligence, you have this superpower because you can use AI for translation or doing illustrations or iterating your ideas, whatever it might be, writing basic reports, you're going to be that much more marketable.
I've got one last question, conscious of time. There's we mentioned the big tech companies and the independent startups, billions of dollars and pounds going into all this. And here's me using ChatGPT. I haven't got a subscription. I'm getting it for free now and again. How are they going to make some money? How are they going to get this money back and then make some money? Because the VCs are investing a lot of money in it. They're obviously expecting some sort of return. But where's that actually going to come from?
That's the billion-dollar question, the trillion-dollar question. So so there are people who are subscribing to it. That's turning into significant revenue. I used to be like you and use it for free, but I use it so often sometimes that they're capped. You could ask it, 6-8 queries a day kind of thing. And like, well, I want to use it more. So I pay my $20 a month. And there'll probably be a lot of people like that. These things, they're largely IQ, but they're getting better at EQ, emotional intelligence. And so I think there are going to be people who are using this and paying for it for companionship, romance, kind of as a cheaper therapist, and so, and that's something that people would pay for. But largely, I think the money is going to come from businesses. large corporations, small corporations are going to be paying, and they're paying a lot more than $20, a month for it. Maybe they want to integrate a chatbot into their website, into their customer service. They're becoming very popular, the chatbots in customer service, and you have to pay for that. But that's a huge issue. In fact, in my book, the main company I follow, this company Inflection, co-founded by Reid Hoffman and Mustafa Suleyman, who I mentioned earlier, their big thing was EQ, emotional intelligence. And it was astounding. I would talk to it about tough issues. It was really interesting. But they gave up. They basically sold out to Microsoft because they realized, okay, we've raised $1.5 billion already. We're going to raise another $2 billion for next year. We're going to have to raise $5 or $10 billion after that. And we're still not going to be making money. We're still going to be losing money. So we have to raise money, and we're going up against Google with $100 billion in the bank, Microsoft with $100 billion in the bank. And so Mustafa, the CEO and co-founder, he concluded that, we just can't compete. This is basically a commodity. We charge a lot. Well, they'll just go use Google's Gemini or Anthropic's Claude, kind of thing. And so, that is the big worry. And that's my worry that, it's in the end going to be the big tech giants that dominate. In fact, I started off thinking I'm going to focus on startups, that I'm going to look for who's the next Google, who's the next Facebook, and I ended up concluding probably Google's going to be the next Google, and Facebook or Meta is going to be the next Facebook, because this stuff is so expensive when we're so far off. We're at least several years away from these things, turning a profit.
Yeah, you've been following and been very interested in writing about big tech for, 30 years now?
Yeah, 30 years.
So my next question really is, you've seen the developments. Most of the population really only heard about AI probably 2 or 3 years ago. We've probably heard about it, but started using it. What's the next big thing after this?
Oh boy. First off, I think we're in the, early stage of this big thing. AI is incredible now, but it's getting exponentially better. And, there might be some kind of limit. I'm sure there'll be more breakthroughs. So I think we're early on. It is like in 1997, you asking what's coming after the internet. And I just want to say to you, well, there's a lot more of the internet to come. But, I don't know. There is a lot of talk about, wearables. This idea that, glasses or a pin that, we could just, at a Star Trek, touch your chest and say, tell me the best places to go if I'm visiting in London. And it just kind of gives you all these answers and stuff. So, there's talk of the metaverse. Facebook changed its name to Meta because of the metaverse. It was a kind of premature to say the least. They wasted many billions of dollars on that. But that's not to say that the metaverse, this idea that we could all kind of hang out in these made up worlds. If, you and I meeting, my avatar would be talking to your avatar, in these made up worlds and all. And so, I don't know. It's impossible to say, but, for me, I just think that I want to pay attention to where AI is going and, fintech and all these other things. I'll let other people pay attention to that.
I've got one more question. This is a special question. And I thought, well, as we're talking about AI, I'll ask ChatGPT to ask you a question. So what I said to it was, can you suggest a question to ask that isn't necessarily related to tech and AI? And it came up with, when you are not researching or writing, how do you like to unwind?
I like to cook. I am the cook in my family, and there's just something kind of physical and mindless about cooking. I have a dog in the other room, and I live really close to Central Park. So, when the weather's nice, I'm at Central Park 4 or 5 days a week. Actually, point, that's very clever. But that's really interesting. That, right? Isn't that interesting that this bot, this large language model wants to get to sort of the human element here? Okay, you're working on AI, but what do you do other than work? Kind of thing. That's interesting to me.
When I was listening to you on the Mike Carruthers show, Something You Should Know, you'd mentioned that you'd said how many ingredients you had in your cupboard, and it came up with a meal for you to cook.
Right, exactly.
Which I thought was great, because that's a good use. That's a good use of it, really, isn't it?
No, I do that. Right now, oh, I have too much parsley in my fridge. I don't want it to go bad. Like, what can I do with it? It's kind of
Yeah,
a
yeah,
fun way of using it. And again, as a journalist, I tried ChatGPT, I tried Claude, I tried Perplexity, I tried Gemini, I tried Copilot. I use them all, and it's funny. I have my favorites for different tasks. ChatGPT is my favorite for food related, recipe related ones. Claude is my favorite editor. Perplexity is my favorite researcher. So it's some of the battle. Who's going to win out here? It's interesting to kind of see the strengths and weaknesses. Though I'm convinced that kind of the winner of the chatbot wars is going to be the one that figures out emotional intelligence. That
yes,
you like talking to this thing. It's just
yeah,
like it has a nice style. Like maybe you like kind of a more conversational, lighter style rather than some sound very machine-like for
yeah.
obvious reasons. So I actually do think kind of the soft skills, let's call it, are going to be what wins it for one chatbot or another.
Where can people reach you and find out more about you?
I have my website, GaryRivlin.com. My email's right there. You can send me a note.
Well, Gary, this has been a really fascinating conversation. It's been interesting to learn more about AI, the history, the companies, and the people, and also hearing about how AI can help us, some of the issues, and how we can contend with them. My guest today has been Gary Rivlin. You can find out more about Gary and his book, AI Valley, Microsoft, Google, and the $1 trillion race to cash in on artificial intelligence on the links in the show notes. Thank you for coming on the show, Gary.
Thanks, Bob. It was a pleasure.